Hi, so this is Harvesting Infinity, and I am super excited that Beryl Bender is here because I found out in doing some research before the show that she and I had a lot in common that I had no idea that we had in common. So I'm going to zoom out to the airplane view, and then we'll get into whichever parts you end up feeling like talking about. So here's the airplane view. When we were younger, we were both very curious. You studied philosophy and I studied physics, and we got into it after lots of side trips. You became an actress and I became a rock bass player and went on tour with that. But then we came back to our practice and we learned how to do stuff well enough that we began to teach other people how to do it. So we went from a practitioner to a teacher, and then we formed organizations around us to allow us to continue teaching. And here it is many years later, and I think we're still curious and we're still seeking. But we learned a lot during these intervening decades about
hopefully
about how to be in the world. And right now the world looks pretty screwy, and a lot of people are wringing their hands. And I noticed that Beryl is not, and I am not. And I wonder about that. So there must be some philosophical stuff going on here. So that's the airplane view. You can talk about whatever part of this you want, but I think you are still teaching people how to be in the world right now. You're still teaching at the Omega Institute.
Right.
I'm still teaching people how to be in the world running the Silicon Valley Innovation Institute. So I think we've come full circle to trying to figure out what's going on and wanting to explain it to others. But I think we're still doing it. What do you think?
That's it. There's nothing more to be said. That's great, Howard.
So,
interesting that you said, you studied physics and I studied philosophy. My studies in philosophy were pretty much a default mode. I went into philosophy because my father was a scientist. He grew up in Wyoming on a ranch, and the story goes he came to the East Coast on a boxcar with $40. I never did get a chance to really go deeper into that with him, but he went to Columbia Graduate School and was a chemist and worked on the development of plastics. And this was in the 40s when the development of plastic was essential for the war effort. And so there was a lot of pressure on me to be smart and to be a scientist. But I was so dyslexic, and it was never done. I didn't know it, and my family didn't know it until I didn't know it till I was in my 50s. And so I had a lot of difficulty in memorizing, and I always felt like I was a very slow learner. I didn't think the people in my physics classes were smarter than I was, but they were a lot faster at being smart than I was. Other people would be turning in their exams, and I'd still be sitting there trying to figure out the questions. And so going into philosophy was it was the one course, and English and comparative religion were the courses that I could get A's in. And so kind of path of least resistance, that's what I did. But you're right, I was incredibly curious as a child. I remember I was an only child and grew up with dogs. And so animals, all my imaginary friends were animals, not people. And I would go out into the woods with my imaginary friends and sit and look up at the stars and the sky and started asking those questions like, what's up there? What's the point? Who am I? What am I doing here? What's my purpose? And I've been asking those questions ever since. And through the grace of divine intervention, I met a wonderful teacher in 1971 from India by the name of Munishri Chitrabhanu. I was in California, and I drove out there with no job and no money and no place to stay from the East Coast, from New York City, and got a job working at the Los Angeles Biofeedback Research Institute. And again, by just pure circumstance, they were studying the brain waves of meditators, of martial artists and advanced meditators. And so I got thrown into the pool with people doing meditation, and through that met someone that introduced me to this Jain monk by the name of Munishri Chitrabhanu. And in one lecture with him, he talked about the law of karma and the law of what's called samsara, or birth and death and rebirth in previous lives, and something just clicked for me. And I began to study yoga, and I had glimmers of that in school because I'd been looking at, comparative religion, but I was a vitriolic atheist in college. I just went, this is a lot of crap. I just, the idea that God was some long white-haired guy sitting up in the heavens in a chair dispensing good and evil just didn't sit well with me. So I'd been curious for a long time, but once I got turned on to yoga and the 8-limb path, which is the other name for it is classical yoga. And once I started that practice, I always like to say if it weren't for yoga, I'd either be dead or in jail. But that started me on this journey of personal evolution.
And
is that a good place to stop?
Well, but you went to live in India too.
Because of Munishri Chitrabhanu. Yeah, I'd been studying with him for several years, and I said he went back and forth from India. He was one of the few teachers from India that came to New York with a fairly impeccable record of working with students. We had a very eclectic Sangha community. I mean, it was a lot of professional people in New York City, directors, actors, lawyers, doctors, who studied with him just pretty regularly. We had lectures on Tuesday and Thursday nights. I started teaching. I had been taking yoga classes, the practice of the postures, or asana, in California through the Shivananda Yoga Center for many years. So when I came to New York in 1979, 1980, I started teaching yoga. Basically, not out of any grand passion to teach, but because I needed to do something to earn a living, and it seemed like something I could do well at. So right after I met him and studied with him in New York for a couple of years, he had a trip to India, and I decided I wanted to go. So I went for almost 6 months.
So how early on did you find out that the yoga and the meditation were really two sides of the same practice, that it wasn't really a physical thing and they were like the same thing?
It's fabulous that you are aware of that, because most people aren't. The word yoga for thousands of years was synonymous with meditation and samadhi or enlightenment. It's only in the last, 50, 100 years or so that it has come to be thought of as exercise, and associated with just the postures. And when I first started taking asana classes in California, I was also introduced to meditation through Chitrabhanu, and I also had the good fortune to meet Choyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was teaching in San Francisco and going back and forth between Boulder and San Francisco. And so I started studying Jain and Buddhist meditation and Hatha Yoga. But I didn't put those two together. I wasn't aware of the 8-limb path, or the format of classical yoga, until I met an asana teacher, my yoga teacher. How do I differentiate this? When I got to New York, by the name of Norman Allen, who gave me my first copy of the Yoga Sutra, which is the text for classical yoga, and lays out this methodology, which is incredibly practical. It's a very empirical practice. There's no ideology or dogma you have to accept. You don't have to sign it. You just, here's the map. follow the map, see where it takes you. If you like it, great. If your life goes better, if you're happier, good. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. So you really verify everything for yourself through your own. It's a very experiential practice. And at that point, I realized, this practice of asana is the third limb of this path, and meditation is on the other side of the bridge. That's one of the inner limbs. That's the seventh limb on in this practice. So asana really is designed as practice for meditation. It begins the process of training the mind in concentration, training you to pay attention.
So maybe you can clear up something I'm confused about.
Oh, dear.
I was exposed to insight meditation in Boston, I don't know, about 1980. But I didn't find out about more of Buddhist things until about 10 years later when I moved to California. And it took me a while to realize that Buddha was an Indian and that he went across the world and he basically brought Buddhism from India to the Far East. But a lot of people that I knew were focused on the greater path, the Mahayana, and Tibetan Buddhism, and they didn't really know anything about any of the Indian stuff, but they wanted to do yoga. And there was a lot of confusion between, well, is yoga Indian or the Far East versus the Near East? And I spent a lot of time wondering about, well, how come all the Buddhist texts are written in Sanskrit, and that's Indian? So did you run into this gap, or a lot of people seem to be dipping toes in both of these ponds?
Not so much. I think the Yoga Sutra is classically an Indian text. It's written, Patanjali, the person who gathered together all this extant information at the time and packaged it into the Yoga Sutras. He didn't invent yoga, but he just gathered what was known about yoga 2,500 years ago and laid it out in a really brilliantly well-organized fashion. Was written in Sanskrit. Sutras are aphorisms that are very short and pithy, and many of them are impossible to understand or decode. If it weren't for some of the commentary that was written in the 5th century and then the 7th century, which kind of formed the bridge going from Patanjali's time to modern times. Now we have 20, 25, 30, many different translations of the Yoga Sutra. When I teach the Yoga Sutra, and everyone in the group has pretty much have different translations of the sutras, and so we'll look at one sutra, and you'll say, I have no idea what he's talking about here. Somebody else read their commentary. Well, what does Chip Hartram say? What does Swami Satchidananda say? What does Edwin Bryant say? And finally, you'll decode that. So Pali, which is the more basic languages, like the difference between Italian and Latin, Pali and Sanskrit. Pali was the language of the people. That's what many of the Buddhist texts were written in Pali. But the original texts very often were Sanskrit. If you go back, and I'm getting to be more interested in the history of the time period around 2,500 years ago, but just as today, there are so many different branches and directions, paths you could take to climb this mountain. And so I didn't get really interested in Theravada, which is the oldest school of Buddhism, until, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, and then started becoming more interested in things like the Anapanasati Sutra, which lays out it's translated as the full awareness of breathing, and it lays out these instructions that Buddha left for his students to help them develop meditation. And it's a parallel text to the Satipatthana Sutra, which lays out the 4 foundations of mindfulness. But this is all, I've acquired all of this in the last 10 years, and it seems, for me, it's very compatible. I love looking at the difference between the Eightfold Path of Buddhism and the Eight-Limb Path of the yoga tradition. So they're incredibly compatible. I think Patanjali, when writing the Yoga Sutra, was very, very influenced by the teachings of Buddhism. There's so many parallels and similarities that when you really dig in there, that you can pull out.
So I've got to imagine that both of these sets of practices, intertwined or separately, are helpful for people to grow older, deal with life. And right now, when many people are wringing their hands, having this toolkit that you have must be very helpful for processing what's going on. Too big? Is that too heavy a question?
The practice of mindfulness, is taught in so many ways by so many people. That satipatthana, the Pali word sati means mindfulness. The practice of mindfulness, the way I like to describe it, is just learning to be in relationship with what is. Mm-hmm. I might look at this and go, this would be better if this were over here, or I like it better over here. If it's over here, I'm going to be unhappy. If it's over here, well, I'll be okay with that. But it's here, And so, can I be happy before I have to move it over there? Can I just be okay with the way it is? Now, the little things, I always feel like that's kind of the leading edge of practice. The little things are what trip you up. You're going through life and somebody goes whizzing by you, and you're going the speed limit, and you look at them and you go, what an asshole, can I say that on here?
Sure.
And you catch yourself. And you've been trained to differentiate, develop your viveka, your discernment, to know the difference between a wholesome thought and an unwholesome thought. Calling someone, wishing, I hope he gets stopped by the police. That's an unwholesome thought. It's just nothing, but that I get tripped up with those, my daily life of being judgmental or not liking something or wishing it were slightly different. And then you catch yourself and you notice, I've been down that road before. I know that leads to unhappiness and pain and suffering. So, may you be happy. May you be safe. May you live with ease. And that wholesome thoughts lead to freedom and happiness. And, it's a practice. People start out looking at wanting to meditate because they are stressed, because someone has said, you need to relax, you need to learn to meditate. So the beginning stages of practicing mindfulness in this particular type of meditation that I practice and teach, vipassana, or insight meditation, mm-hmm. is primarily taught around, let's say, the country now, for stress relief, for relaxation and stress relief. Mindfulness was not invented to help people deal with stress. It's a practice that leads to the insight of enlightenment, answering the question, who am I? That it leads to liberation. It leads to the end of suffering. Buddha taught, what I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. He was a pretty bright guy. He spent a lot of time in studies and meditating and knew a lot more than what he taught. But so through the practice and developing, it starts out where you're training your mind to pay attention. Sit down, focus your attention on your breath. Oh, you get distracted, you hear a sound, you hear a dog barking. Oh, I wonder whose dog that is. I hope that's not my neighbor's dog. That dog always comes over and crabs in my front yard. I'm going to have to tell them not to, and all of a sudden you're off, lost in thought. So you're not here, you're not present. So it's really about training the mind to be present. Once that ability to tell the difference between being here and being lost in thought, that's the first thing you notice when you sit is how much of the time you're distracted. When you really start to sit down and watch, what's going on? I can't meditate. My mind's too busy. As if people say that, and you think, well, do you think you're the only one that thinks you're too busy to meditate? So the first thing you notice is how much you're distracted. After that, the objective is to learn to tell the difference between being present and being lost in thought. Once that begins to happen, you begin to see the insubstantiality of thought. Our thoughts run our lives because a thought leads to an intention leads to an action. And without being, I would say, 92% of the population has no idea, and I said this to you earlier, has no idea that who I am is not what's going on up here. Here I am, here are my thoughts. Think back to when you were younger. When things were going well, they loved you at Silicon Valley, your teachers loved you, they said, he's a bright guy. You were up here. When they didn't love you, when you get fired, when they said, no, when she didn't call, he didn't call, you were down here, and you thought that I'm worthless, nobody loves me, I'm insubstantial. Once, I think meditation, the practice of meditation helps you learn to separate those two, recognize that we can actually stand back and watch our thoughts and recognize them. And once you notice you've been distracted and you catch the thought and you come back to your breath, you see how quickly the thought evaporates. Where is it now? And so that recognition of the insubstantiality of thought, begins to move the needle a little bit. So you get to the place where you can begin to open up your awareness a little more. And anything can be an object of attention. I can close my eyes and sit and listen to, feel sensation, feel sound, a thought will come up, and I can take in all of those things which will keep me in present moment awareness.
So does that also help people accept themselves if they are being less distracted by everything whizzing by, or do they have to sort of realize they're not so substantial to be taken seriously either?
That's a really good question. What do you think? Because
I think we're not that important.
We're not, and really ultimately what this practice leads you to, especially the Vipassana practice, leads you to two things that I've been working on this. I've been teaching a course since last October in meditation, and we've been moving along, and the current eight-week session we're really working with impermanence and recognizing impermanence in anything can happen at any time. There's a great story that Suzuki Roshi, who was the head of the Zen Center in San Francisco, one of his students asked him one time, he says, I've been studying with you for a really long time and going to your retreats and your lectures, and I have no idea what you're talking about. Do you think you could sum up the teaching in like just one word. And Suzuki Roshi looked at him and paused for a minute. And so the student said, well, okay, well, maybe a couple words. Suzuki Roshi paused and he goes, everything changes. And recognizing that is the end of suffering, because if you realize that everything we depend on everything to stay the same, our bodies, our relationships, our parents are always going to be there for us, our kids, our houses. And then we get these dramatic teachings of seeing our house burn down or get lost in a flood or, we lose a family member or something dramatic happens. And those are the moments for me when the mindfulness bell is really loud. It's almost easier. I have to be careful about saying this. I've had 15 Siberian Huskies in the last 50 years. And the last one just died about 4 weeks ago. And so it's the first time that I've been dogless, that I haven't had dogs in my life. And it's very different. And people would come and go, are you okay? Are you really sad? I'm going, it's different. It feels different. But am I devastated? Am I incapable of functioning? There's a certain joyfulness to understanding that everything changes, that we are all of the nature to grow old, to get sick, to die. Do I miss him? Do I miss having dogs? Is it a different experience? But when something dramatic like that happens, the mindfulness bell, to pay attention and recognize the teaching, you only suffer when you're thinking. When I think about him, if I'm thinking about him or remembering what it used to be like or what it could be like or did I do enough or was this the right thing to do, or I don't really ask that many questions because it's just, I've been practicing, living with this impermanence thing since like 1974. And so when you really keep practicing and it's like getting good at playing the piano or playing music. When you first started, you think, oh, I want to play Beethoven. Your teacher says, okay, well, can you do the scales? You go, no, I don't want to play the scales. I want to play Beethoven. It's like, so it's about a practice of just, do I think it will help people? I think the purpose of it is so we can have greater well-being, to be happier, to work toward the goal of liberation, of being free of, and then just catching yourself when you are doing something that goes down the wrong road, goes down the road to suffering.
So I want to venture into a space that may be more adventurous for us because I haven't thought about it before, but I'm somewhat obsessed with innovation. I run an innovation institute, and with improvisation, because I'm a jazz musician. And when I think about acceptance, and I think that humanity has a superpower, which is the ability to adapt, the ability to change. Things happen, we do something. And when things happen in the world that I don't like, I adapt and I change. So it's hard to imagine, well, if I just accept it, then why do I need to change? But you sometimes actually do need to change in order to accept it, but then you can do something about it too. So a lot of people think that they can make a plan and execute it and they'll get to where the plan said they were going to get. But they hardly ever do get there. So life is not an algorithmic recipe where you could say, well, I'm going to do these steps and then I'm going to get to where I'm going to get. That's not how it works. There's a lot of adapting. There's a lot of improvising, a lot of accepting. How does this spiritual stance connect with this adapting, innovating stance? Because I think the act of innovating is kind of involuntary.
I think you're constructing that as a question because that's your job right here at the moment, is to ask me questions. But I think the way that you explain that, you really shows that you already have understanding of the answer to that. Is accepting what is in this moment doesn't mean you lie down and let the world run over you. You know, some of the Neo-Advaita Vedantists go, oh, there's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go, everything is preordained, we just have to sit back and let it unfold. Well, that's true to a certain degree, maybe on the absolute level, but in the relative world, in the dualistic world that we sort of live in, there's the non-dual perspective and the dual perspective. And the fact is that there is plenty to do. You know, that if I see a situation that is arising in this moment, this is what is, and it's coming up in the field of consciousness in front of me, right here, right now. And I perceive it to be unjust or illegal or unfair or something that I cannot abide. I'm going to, in this moment, accept that it's there, but then I'm going to take action, like going to Boston 2 weeks ago to participate in the hands-off demonstrations. I'm going to take action to change what I perceive to be kind of the wrong direction. You know, so there's both things are true, you know, that you accept what is, and then in the next moment there is the capacity to change or innovate or to take something in a different direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that sounds like a good prescription for what to do at any point in time. Right now, maybe a lot of things are happening that not everybody likes, and even if things are happening that everybody does like, in both cases, they're going to change, and you're going to respond, and you're going to adapt to these changes. So it sounds like a good kind of prescription for maintaining your sanity.
You know, I've always felt that, going way, 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 way back, that nothing is a mistake, that everything happens, you know, this sounds kind of trite, but everything happens for a reason. Now, there's an appropriate time to say that to someone and an inappropriate time to say, you know, if someone is suffering and struggling or going through a dramatic loss of some kind, I wouldn't exactly recommend going, yeah, well, you know, everything happens for a reason. But think about it. I mean, think about our lives. Aren't the difficult, challenging times the moments when we've had the most accelerated growth? I mean, you know, my grandmother used to say, well, if it doesn't kill you, it'll cure you. I heard, forgot where I was going with it. Something, I thought of a quote from the Dalai Lama, but now I've forgotten it again. But I think, you know, I think that recognizing the challenging times as teachers, as, okay, I got it, I'm paying attention here, you know, what direction do you want me to go next? I mean, Matthew Fox, who is a great hero of mine, he was a former Catholic priest. He got thrown out of the church and for his views on women and abortion, and started a wonderful church in California. He wrote a book with Rupert Sheldrake, who's a British biologist, and they were talking. I was listening to a lecture they were giving just, I don't know, last week some point about calling in the angels. And Sheldrake was describing it as, you know, from a quantum physics perspective, and Matthew Fox was describing angels from a spiritual perspective, and they were dramatically similar. You know, that to Sheldrake, an angel is a quanta. To Matthew Fox, he says, well, it's, you know, there are a lot of unemployed angels flying around. He said, you know, they just call them in. They're just looking for work, looking for things to do. So, you know, when you are facing a challenging time, I always think, okay, you know, I'm thinking when my first book was published, it was delayed because my original publisher was Macmillan. It got taken over by Simon and
Schuster.
Viacom bought, I forget who bought what, but it ended up, my book got shuffled into Simon & Schuster from Macmillan because Macmillan got bought up and delayed 6 months. And I was so, how can you do this to me? This isn't fair. It's supposed to come out. It needs to come out. Oh, well, we're publishing this other book. Well, this other yoga book, we can't do 2 yoga books in one. And I put up a lot of resistance, creating a lot of unnecessary suffering for myself. So some things you just can't change. So I kindly just stepped back and said, okay, there's some reason this is happening. You don't always see what those are until 6 months later I realized, oh my God, this is the perfect time for this to be released. And it was.
You've just sort of described how you learn more from your failures maybe than from your successes. And this is so true in Silicon Valley that when a startup entrepreneur who's an engineer wants to go talk to investors to invest in a company, they don't want to actually invest in you until you have failed a couple of times. If you have never failed at all,
that's great.
Then they know that you're kind of too attached to your process and your vision and what you think is going to happen. And they sort of invest in people who have been able to deal with failure more gracefully than others, because they know that failure is a pretty high likelihood of happening. But if they invest in a person who has failed and coped with it and learned something and moved forward, they're a better candidate for a future investment. And they weren't so much, I don't think they were consciously thinking of a metaphysical perspective, but they came to the same conclusion, which is, until you've done a few face plants, you don't really know what the score is. Because when you're younger and arrogant and think you're brilliant and you haven't yet failed, you do not have a realistic view of the world. But after you fail a few times, and you can recognize entrepreneurs by they're the ones with the arrows in their backs, because they have started something, it didn't quite work, and after this many years of failing a bunch of times and succeeding a few, it doesn't matter as much to me anymore. I do a thing, I put it out in the world, and I go, well, it might work, it might not work. This person may show up, they may not show up, I may get funded, I may not. I don't know. And I'm no longer as freaked out about it as I used to be, because I go, well, whatever's supposed to happen, it's going to turn out. And if what turns out I don't like, I'll do something else. I'll do something about it. But it's taken a long time to become sanguine about that and not be overly attached to being right. Because I found out that being wrong doesn't kill you. You could be wrong a lot, and you keep going.
Being right takes us down so that desire to, we were just talking about that in my class last week, is this desire to be right. Sometimes you may recognize that something comes up during meditation. Like once you're able to recognize thoughts and let them go, you begin to work with emotions. Emotions are a little stickier. They're a little more amorphous. They don't have such clear beginnings and endings as when you see a thought come up and it goes along for a while and you get on the bus and you get carried off and you go, up thinking. You come back to your breath or whatever you're focusing on, right? But when you have an emotion come up like anger or depression or irritation or and you're annoyed with somebody and that's coming up, it's like you're plugged into that, and that's coming up during meditation, right? First you have to recognize it. Oh, I see you coming in there. Come on, anger, come on in, have a seat. I'm meditating right now. I can't deal with you right now. Then you accept that it's there. You're not trying to push him out the door and keep it away. There's an important element of accepting what is arising. This is what is coming up in your field of consciousness right now. You may know that being angry isn't going to lead you or anything else around you into a happier, more productive, more peaceful state. But it feels so good. You have such attachment to wanting to be right. But I'm right about this, and I'm not letting go of this until that other person recognizes that they're wrong. There's something triumphant about that. And that's the grasp of, that's the greediness of the ego. And the last phase of, I think, of years and years and years of meditation is recognizing that selflessness, that there really is no self here, that there isn't someone inside my head that is looking out at the world. That there is, when you're meditating, you ask the question, who is watching? Who is hearing that sound? Who is thinking? And if you try and go out and turn around and look back to see, well, who's thinking? And because we often feel like we're on the edge of what's going on, and that creates that sense of separateness. If I look at the two of, well, it's clear that my visual field is telling me that you're over there and I'm over here, and there's all this space in between. We're clearly separate. But that's total delusion, as you know, as a physicist, that we're a field of energy in dynamic exchange with everything around us. There is nothing solid about this. How are we doing?
We're doing good. So this is a good introduction to the next thought I have,
dear.
Which is, we've been talking about what sort of relationship do we have with the universe. But there are also the relationships we have with other people. And that's in part the relationship with the universe, but as we get older, I've become aware that projects are less important to me than relationships. So completing a project, a book, an album, what matters more now to me is how do I maintain appropriate relationships with people that matter to me. And some of what you've been dancing around has a lot to do with relationship. And a lot of the value, especially as we're getting older, a lot of the value in our life is in our relationships, not just our relationship with the universe, but our relationship with each other. And if I were going to offer a prescription to the world about how to fix what's wrong right now, I go, well, we have two choices. We need to either take care of each other or we're going to perish. That's what it's about. So how do you feel about this with respect to relationship? Because that's a big part of our meaning, but we also have to take it with a certain amount of detachment. But one of the things where we met in this little Wednesday group,
the left bank group is what I call them.
Left bank. It's important for people to get together.
Yeah.
And just hanging out in a Zoom, well, it's okay, but it's not as good as in person. And a phone call has less bandwidth than a Zoom, and a letter may be less, but in person is where it's really at. But not that many people are trying to get together in person necessarily.
It's so important.
So what do you think about this relationship from this perspective?
About 4 years ago, I did a program, a 10-hour video course for Yoga International on yoga and longevity. And I had just finished reading The Blue Zones, which talks about the areas around the world where a significant percentage of the population lives to be 100. And Dan Buettner, who was the author of the book, was a National Geographic researcher, and he gathered some of the folks from Nat Geo, and they went around the world, and they looked at these different populations, and a lot of your viewers probably know this story of what are the commonalities among these people? What are they? Is it the water? Is it what they're eating? And they identified 9 different things that all of these various pockets of people had in common. And when I looked at that, I went, what he's talking about is the yoga lifestyle. Move, meditate, be able to learn how to down-regulate, how to self-regulate, be in community, eat plants, and I went, yes, I love that. And that's what I used, and then I kind of made the parallels between that and the yoga lifestyle and did this program. But one of the most significant aspects of longevity or healthy aging is being in community, in person. And I think it's essential to, and I mean, what makes us happy? I heard someone ask the Dalai Lama once, what is our ultimate purpose in life? And I thought he was going to say to eliminate suffering. And he said to be happy. Well, if you don't know the Dalai Lama, you could think, well, that's kind of, that's kind of self-serving. Is my only goal to be happy in life? But when you think about what really makes you happy, it's making other people happy. It's service. It's serving your community, being of some ultimate good to, I mean, that's why I started the Give Back Yoga Foundation, is that we had, my co-founder and I, we had this desire to give back to the community, to pass the methodology along to others. But there was this was in my program, and I don't remember. It may have been the Framingham study, or it may have been a Harvard study that followed a significant number of people over a long period of time. But one of the things they found was that the most important factor that contributed to longevity was healthy relationships. Hanging out with people who support your well-being, who support your healthy behaviors. So if you just quit drinking and you're 3 weeks alcohol-free, and now you're going, yes, I'm going down to the corner bar and I'm going to tell those folks how much better they're going to feel if they quit drinking. And you get down there and somebody says, oh, just have one shot with me. You may not be on firm enough ground to convert the people in the bar, So I think it's, I think you want to be around, you want to choose to be around people that are going to support your healthy behavior. And that can be hard because often we're in relationships and families where not everybody is on the same, not on board with what constitutes healthy behavior. What do you think?
I think, so here's an example of where this worked for me. So in Sangha, if you try to meditate by yourself versus if you meditate with a group of people who are all meditating together, it's a different ballgame completely.
Yes, it is.
When you're meditating with a group, it's so much more powerful. So that's one illustration of this kind of relationship. It's difficult to be anything in the world, to be spiritually oriented, to be... And you need kindred spirits to do it with, because sometimes you lose concentration. But if we're with a whole group of people, and a few people lose their concentration, but other people still are like with it, then you could tune back in and catch up again. And so for me, relationship is critical. And since most of my friends are what I'd call creative outliers.
That's a great expression.
A lot of creative outliers sort of invent their own world and then they go live in it. But they don't necessarily get into a feedback loop with reality because they're having a relationship with their ideas and their mind and the things they're creating. But they do have to actually get into a feedback loop with some external reality to themselves in order to be more sane. And so I think we do need these relationships desperately, or we're in danger of living in a fantasy universe. We need this feedback. We need this flywheel. In fact, we call this thing, this great parenting thing, is called the creator's flywheel. Because the notion was that by yourself, you kind of could miss a beat, or you're intermittent. But with a group, it's more likely to actually continue forward. And engines have flywheels to smooth out the intermittent impulses of the cylinders, too. So a flywheel is a concept that's not normally applied to people. It's normally applied to mechanisms. But in my mind, creative people especially need a flywheel because we all have these complicated mental processes.
That is so articulate. And I think what you're doing and the way you express it is so important that you put that out in the world. That's why I think this opportunity to have discussions like this and have them broadcast out through YouTube or on the local channels is, and I think you're the perfect person to do this, because just starting this group on this Wednesday group where a bunch of people get together and just talk about politics and philosophy and science and whatever's going on in the world. You're absolutely right. It motivates you to hold the line, to stay steady, to keep moving forward. You can it's easy if you're on your own to just kind of fall by the wayside and go, oh, I don't feel like, it can be as simple as just calling a friend to go for a walk. I might say, oh God, it's gray and gloomy and it's 45 degrees and I don't feel like going out, and then a friend will call and say, hey, you want to go for a walk? And I go, nah, I really don't. But you go and you get out and you think, oh my God, it's a beautiful day, and you need that support. In the Buddhist tradition, there are 3 pillars to the practice. There's the Buddha, the teacher, the Dharma, the teaching, and the Sangha, the community. And each one of them has an equal degree of importance in sustaining the practice. That you can lean on the teacher or the teaching or the group, the community, to support your forward momentum, to support your growth. What I liked when I first started getting more deeply into Buddhism was the fact that Buddha was just somebody like you and me. He wasn't held up as the son of God, or that he was just a person who walked the earth, followed this practice all the way to the end, and said, hey, I did it. I reached enlightenment, and if I did it, you can do it. Someone asked him once if there would always be enlightened people in the world, and he said, as long as there are people who are following the Eightfold Path, there will be enlightened beings in the world. And I'm going, that's encouraging. Good. I'm not sure I'll make it this lifetime, but maybe only a few more.
So I think we have time for one more topic, which is the one that we agreed to get together to talk about, but we never mentioned.
Oh, dear.
So when we first said maybe we should get together and have this conversation, we were having a conversation about consciousness and being conscious, and what's the difference? And I know we're not going to be able to answer this with any finite amount of words, but I had to bring it up because it was the reason why we said that we wanted to have a conversation. But we never actually talked about that.
To me, the word conscious, are you conscious of the fact that of the time? Am I conscious that we have 8 minutes left, or am I conscious of the fact that this is a red tablecloth? It's sort of synonymous, whether this is accurate or not, I don't know, to be aware of. Consciousness, for me, is fundamental. It's what everything, it's the God particle. It's what everything is made out of. Several years ago, I was a speaker at the Science and Consciousness Conference, which is put on by the University of Arizona, and every other year they either have it in Tucson or they have it somewhere around the world. This coming summer it's in Barcelona, and there are physicists and neuroscientists from all over the world that gather, and I was so excited to be going to this. I was teaching meditation, and in my course description I said, and everybody's looking for consciousness, it's all this, well, let's look at the telomeres or the microbiome or look at the mitochondria, where is consciousness? And I'm going, seriously? You're never going to find it looking from the outside in, that the only way to understand consciousness from my perspective, is from the inside out. You have to get quiet, sit down, go inside, and take a look at what's going on. And so I wrote up this what I thought, clever description of what I was going to do, and I said that, that consciousness can only be discovered from the inside out. And then I went to teach my class, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people at this conference, and only 2 of them came to my program. And I went, talk about feeling like an outlier. I went, this is, I don't know. I don't think I'm in the right place here. Yeah, consciousness is the field in which all of this is happening. What do you think?
So I think the universe is a very dimensionally vast place.
Well said.
And that we are only conscious of a very small portion of what's going on, and that our unconscious is actually aware of a lot more things than our conscious mind is aware of. So I get lost sometimes between unconscious and conscious. Consciousness is more like the dimensional vastness of the universe. It's not about what tiny percentage of it I think
exactly
I'm dealing with.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that it's unfortunate that the word conscious and consciousness have the same root, because there's nothing similar about them. You know, I think consciousness, and when I think about consciousness, it has a capital C. You know, it's like universal awareness. It's like divine, one spirit. I hate to say it's synonymous for me with, it's what I think people are talking about when they say God, but most people, for God, for most people, is something, is a thing or an it or a, which is why there's so many disagreements about what it is. You know, in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali gets around that really nicely by saying, defining God as vibration, as a sound, as the sound Om. And that reminds me of something Michio Kaku said to me one time, who I was at another Science and Consciousness conference as a participant. And I asked him if it was too late to start studying physics. After his lecture, right, I went to him, I said, is it too late for me to start to study? He says, how's your math? I went, never mind, I got the answer. And I'm trying to remember where I was going with that. What did he say about it? Oh, he said, we particle physicists get paid millions of dollars to search for one more, to search for the God particle. And he said, all we end up coming up with is one more goddamn subatomic particle. He said, ultimately, I think what we'll discover is that the universe is nothing more than this, than vibration or wave or music. I went...
That's where I ended up, and that's why I became an acoustician, because I was a musician, and I thought it was all about waves, light waves, sound waves, pressure waves, temperature. So I thought it was all waves. And when I found out that the physicists were talking about particles and waves and the dual nature, I said, this is the subject I should really, really study. And I spent 10 years in college taking every course in waves that I could. I took it underwater acoustics, airborne acoustics, speaker design, mechanical engineering, vibration theory. And the dean of the college said, you're going to have to decide what you're trying to get a graduate degree in. You're all over the map. Like, are you a physics major or mechanical engineering? Or, like, what are you studying? I said, everything about vibrations and waves. He said, what kind of a curriculum is that? I said, that's the Lieberman curriculum. I want to know about waves. He said, but that's not a degree. I said, I don't care about a degree. He said, what do you mean you don't care about a degree? That's why you go to college. I said, that's why you went to college. That's not why I'm going to college. I'm going to college to find out about waves. And they thought I was crazy, but I thought it made a lot of sense to me. And although I dropped out of 3 different doctoral programs, I still ended up being the dean of a college who did not have a PhD because I knew a lot about waves.
Acoustician. That doesn't sound like nearly a sophisticated enough title. It needs...
Well, actually, it was in electroacoustics. So it was the combination of electrical engineering and physical acoustics. So that's why it took 10 years.
Fascinating. There's so, well... we might have to postpone the the consciousness conversation for a future time.
But I think we did it.
Look, 59:47. You said an hour, and we are only 8 seconds away from an hour.
Yeah. So this was Harvesting Infinity. I think episode 15. Were we harvesting infinity? I don't know. You tell us. I think so.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Beryl.